I stood outside his door, my heart pounding. Should I go in? His voice echoed in my head. Please, just for a minute. One choice, and everything could be ruined. When Dylan stood in the doorway of his room, his voice was low, hesitant, yet filled with a quiet desperation. Please, Rachel, can you come in for a minute? I froze, unsure of what to say or do. It was such a simple request, but something about the way he asked it sent a ripple through me. A warning, a promise, or perhaps a mix of. What happens when the boundaries you swore you'd never cross suddenly blur in the quiet moments you never expected? That night, I wasn't just stepping into my stepson's room. I was stepping into a storm I didn't know how to weather. The lines between family, loneliness, and desire became a tangled mess that I could no longer ignore. Looking back, I wonder if I should have walked away that night, turned my back on the pleading look in his eyes. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped forward, crossing a threshold that would change everything. What would you do if your deepest insecurities and unmet needs led you to a choice that could shatter everything you hold dear? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more compelling narratives. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. I love connecting with viewers like you. Now, let's get into this tale of love, betrayal, and the consequences of a single decision. When Dylan stood in the doorway, his voice low and uncertain, I never imagined how much that moment would redefine everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, and my family. Please, Rachel, he said, eyes searching mine, can we just hang out tonight? It was a simple request, one that shouldn't have carried any weight, yet something in his voice, earned and pleading, made it impossible to refuse. It had been another lonely evening. Greg was away on business, as he so often was, and I had become adept at filling the silence of our home with chores and episodes of forgettable TV shows. But Dylan's unexpected invitation cut through the monotony, stirring an unfamiliar energy. Sure, I replied hesitantly. What did you have in mind? Through a movie in my room, he said with a boyish grin that reminded me of when he first came into my life, a gangly teenager awkwardly navigating the blended family dynamic. Now, at 20, he had grown into a man, confident, attentive, and unexpectedly charming. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing snacks for our impromptu movie night, while my mind raced with second thoughts. Was this weird? Watching a movie with my stepson wasn't inherently strange, but the intimacy of his room, his sanctuary, felt oddly personal. When I walked into Dylan's room, the atmosphere immediately struck me. It wasn't the messy bachelor pad I had expected. The room was tidy, lit by the warm glow of a bedside lamp, and the scent of his cologne lingered faintly in the air. A blanket was already spread out on the floor in front of his TV, with pillows arranged to create a cozy nook. Wow, you've really set the mood, I teased, trying to lighten the sudden tension I felt. Dylan chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, well, I wanted it to be nice. We settled in, the movie playing as I tried to focus on the screen, but my mind wandered. Dylan sat closer than I had anticipated, his presence filling the space between us. It was harmless, I told myself. Yet, when his arm brushed against mine as he reached for the popcorn, I felt an unexpected jolt, a spark I immediately suppressed. About halfway through the movie, Dylan paused it. You're not even watching, he said with a smirk, catching me lost in thought. Sorry, I mumbled, flustered. It's just been a long day. You don't have to explain, he said softly. His tone had shifted, less playful, more serious. I know it's been hard with Dad gone so much. I stiffened. It's fine, I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be. His words lingered, heavy and sincere. You do so much for this family, for him. I don't think he even realizes how lucky he is. Caught off guard, I looked at him. His eyes were warm, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Admiration? Something deeper. My breath hitched and I quickly looked away. "You're sweet, Dylan," I said, trying to deflect. "But you don't have to worry about me." "I can't help it," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the movie played in a blur. I was hyper-aware of every movement, every shared glance, every word exchanged. By the time the credits rolled, the air between us felt charged, the silence stretching longer than it should. "Thanks for hanging out with me," Dylan said as I gathered my things to leave. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile, but as I stood at the door, I hesitated. He looked so vulnerable sitting there, his usually confident demeanor softened by something unspoken. "Good night, Dylan," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Good night," he replied, his gaze lingering on me as I stepped out of the room. In the solitude of my bedroom, I couldn't escape the weight of the evening. I replayed every detail, questioning my feelings and my judgment. It was nothing, I assured myself, just a lonely boy seeking connection. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning dawned quietly, the house still and bathed in the soft light of early spring. I tried to shake off the unease from the previous night, focusing on my morning routine. Coffee in hand, I settled at the kitchen island, scrolling through emails and pretending my thoughts weren't tugging me back to Dylan. It wasn't uncommon for him to sleep late on weekends, so when he appeared in the doorway just past noon, it caught me off guard. He was dressed casually in a fitted t-shirt and joggers, his hair still tousled from sleep. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Good afternoon," I teased, grateful for the lightheartedness. He smirked and leaned against the counter. "Late night. Thanks for hanging out with me yesterday." "Of course." "It was nice," I said, carefully keeping my tone neutral. His gaze lingered on me for a moment too long, as if he was searching for something. I shifted uncomfortably, turning my attention to the steaming cup of coffee in my hands. The day unfolded quietly, with both of us occupying separate corners of the house. I busied myself with chores, consciously avoiding crossing paths with him, but even as I folded laundry or wiped down counters, I could feel his presence, an almost magnetic pull that made me hyper-aware of every creak of the floorboards and every shadow that passed the doorway. By mid-afternoon, I decided to tackle the garden, desperate for an excuse to get outside and clear my head. The rhythmic motion of pulling weeds and trimming bushes helped soothe my nerves. I had just started to relax when I heard his voice behind me. "Need some help?" I turned to see Dylan standing on the patio, hands shoved into his pockets, looking both hesitant and eager. "You don't have to," I said quickly, wiping my hands on my jeans. "I want to," he replied, stepping down into the yard before I could protest further. We worked side by side in companionable silence, the afternoon sun casting golden light over the garden. There was an ease in our interactions that felt almost normal, but every so often I caught him watching me. Subtle glances that made my heart race, despite my best efforts to ignore them. As we finished up, he handed me a glass of water and gestured to the patio chairs. "Take a break with me?" I hesitated, but the hopeful look in his eyes disarmed me. "Sure," I said, sitting down and feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. "I've missed this," he said after a moment, his voice quiet. "This?" I asked, glancing at him. "Being home, spending time with you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt a pang of guilt, unsure of how to respond. "It's nice to have you home," I said finally, keeping my tone light. He smiled faintly but didn't say anything more, and we sat there in a silence that felt both comfortable and charged. That evening, I found myself in the kitchen again, preparing dinner while Dylan worked on his laptop at the dining table. The quiet companionship should have been comforting, but I couldn't shake the tension that had been building all day. You're really good at this, you know, Dylan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Of what? I asked, glancing over my shoulder. Making this house feel like home, he said, his expression sincere. It never felt like this before you came along. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. That's sweet of you to say, I managed, turning back to the stove. I mean it, he continued. Dad, he's lucky to have you. The mention of Greg felt like a splash of cold water pulling me back to reality. We do our best, I said, forcing a smile. But Dylan didn't drop it. Does he know how lucky he is? I froze for a moment, then turned to face him. Dylan, that's not a conversation we need to have. Why not? He pressed, his gaze steady. Because it's not appropriate, I said firmly, trying to keep my voice even. Wow. He looked like he wanted to argue, but stopped himself, shaking his head instead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's fine, I interrupted, my tone softer this time. Let's just leave it. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the weight of his words. As I lay in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the day in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a young man expressing gratitude in his own way. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. And worse, I knew I wasn't entirely blameless. There was something in the way I lingered when he spoke, in the way I allowed myself to notice his charm and his presence, that felt like a betrayal. The next morning, I resolved to set firmer boundaries. I would create distance for both our sakes. But as I descended the stairs, I found Dylan waiting in the kitchen, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. Good morning, he said, his tone warm and familiar. Morning, I replied cautiously, keeping my distance. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that he wasn't going to make it easy for me. Every conversation, every shared moment seemed to pull us closer, and I felt myself slipping further into dangerous territory. That evening, the tension between Dylan and me finally reached a boiling point. After dinner, Greg called to let me know he'd be staying an extra week for his business trip, and though I assured him everything was fine at home, the conversation left me feeling hollow. The weight of his absence and the growing unease within me were becoming unbearable. After hanging up, I found myself lingering in the kitchen, staring blankly at the sink as I washed dishes. The sound of footsteps startled me, and I turned to see Dylan leaning in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Everything okay? He asked, his voice softer than usual. I nodded quickly, trying to mask my unease. Yeah, just tired, and stepped closer, his movements deliberate. You've been on edge all day. I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. It's nothing, really. But Dylan wasn't convinced. Is it Dad? He asked, his tone laced with frustration. Because if it is, you don't have to pretend everything's fine. Dylan, I began, but he cut me off. No, Rachel, I see it. I see how much you do for him, how much you sacrifice, and he doesn't even notice. It's not fair. His words hit a nerve I wasn't prepared to confront, and I felt my defenses crumbling. It's complicated, I said weakly, turning back to the sink. Dylan closed the distance between us, his presence overwhelming. It doesn't have to be, he said, his voice low and steady. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. What are you saying? He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. I'm saying you deserve more than this, more than him. The air between us felt charged, the weight of his confession hanging heavily in the silence. I shook my head, taking a step back. Dylan, this isn't... But before I could finish, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch sent a jolt through me, and I froze, torn between pulling away and staying rooted in place. You don't have to say anything, he said softly, his eyes locked onto mine. I just I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. Dylan, stop, I whispered, my voice trembling. This isn't right. He took another step closer, his hand moving to gently cup my face. But it doesn't feel wrong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have pulled away, I should have stopped him, but in that moment, the weight of my loneliness and the intensity of his gaze overpowered my better judgment. Before I knew it, his lips were on mine, soft, tentative, but full of unspoken longing. For a brief, fleeting moment, I let myself get lost in the kiss, the world around us fading into nothing. But reality came crashing back all too quickly, and I pulled away, my breath coming in shaky gasps. This can't happen, I said, my voice breaking. It can't. Dylan looked at me, his expression a mix of heartbreak and desperation. I know, he said quietly, but I can't help how I feel. I stepped back, putting more distance between us. We can't do this, Dylan. We can't. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my heart heavy with guilt and confusion. The rest of the night was a blur. I locked myself in my room, replaying the moment over and over in my mind, berating myself for letting it happen. I knew it was wrong. Knew I had crossed a line that should never have been approached, let alone crossed. But beneath the guilt and shame, there's something else. Something I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. The next morning, I avoided Dylan completely, staying in my room until I was sure he had left the house. When I finally emerged, the emptiness of the house was almost suffocating. I tried to busy myself with chores, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before. The way he had looked at me, the softness of his touch, the vulnerability in his voice. It was all too much to process. By the time evening rolled around, I was a mess of nerves and emotions. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner when I heard the front door open. Rachel? Dylan's voice called out hesitantly. I froze, my heart pounding. In here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He appeared in the doorway, his expression cautious. Can we talk? I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to say no, but the look in his eyes, so full of regret and longing, made it impossible to refuse. Okay, I said, setting down the dish towel and motioning for him to sit at the table. He sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly together. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence heavy and suffocating. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice trembling. I shouldn't have kissed you. I nodded, my throat tight. It was a mistake, I said softly, though the words felt hollow. He looked down at his hands, his jaw clenched. I know it was wrong, but I can't stop feeling the way I do, and I don't think I want to. Dylan, you have to, I said, my voice firm despite the tears welling in my eyes. This can't happen again. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with pain. I just want you to be happy, he said quietly. I didn't know how to respond, so I said nothing. The conversation ended with a painful silence, and Dylan retreated to his room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I sat there in the dimly lit kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. The house felt heavier than ever the next morning. The silence was deafening, and though I tried to focus on my daily routine, every small sound, the creak of the floor, the faint hum of the fridge, seemed to amplify the tension that hung in the air. I knew I couldn't avoid Dylan forever. The kiss had left a mark, one that wouldn't fade simply by pretending it hadn't happened, yet I still found myself doing everything I could to avoid crossing paths with him, hoping to keep my emotions in check. But by late afternoon, that fragile plan unraveled. I was sitting in the living room with a book I wasn't reading when Dylan appeared at the doorway, his expression resolute. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I sighed, closing the book and setting it aside. "Dylan, I don't think—" "Please," he interrupted, stepping further into the room. "I just need to say this. After that, I'll leave you alone. I promise." There was a rawness in his voice that I couldn't ignore, and despite every instinct telling me to shut this down, I nodded. "Fine," I said, gesturing for him to sit across from me. He sat on the edge of the armchair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. For a moment he didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he took a deep breath and looked up at me. "I've been thinking about what happened," he began. "And I know it was wrong. I know I crossed a line that I never should have gone near. But I can't. I can't pretend I don't feel the way I feel." "Dylan," I started, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "Let me finish," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. "You've been there for me in ways no one else has. You've cared for me, supported me, made this house feel like a home. And I know I shouldn't see you as anything other than my stepmom, but I can't help it. You mean so much to me, Rachel. More than you probably realize." His words left me stunned. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, a mix of anger, guilt, and something far more dangerous. "Dylan, this isn't fair," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to me, and it's not fair to your father." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's selfish, and I hate that I've put you in this position, but I need you to know how I feel. I can't keep it bottled up anymore." "And what do you expect me to do with that, Dylan?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Do you think I can just forget that I'm married to your father, that this family isn't built on a foundation that would crumble if anyone found out what happened between us?" "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said, his tone desperate. "I just needed to be honest, to tell you the truth, even if it makes things harder." I stood, unable to sit still any longer. Pacing the room, I tried to calm the storm raging inside me. "This is a mess," I muttered, more to myself than to him. A complete mess. Dylan stood as well, but he kept his distance. "I'll leave," he said quietly. "If that's what you need, I'll go back to campus early. I don't want to make things harder for you." His offer caught me off guard. The idea of him leaving should have felt like a relief, a solution to the unbearable tension between us. But instead it left me feeling hollow, like I was losing something I didn't fully understand. "You don't have to leave," I said softly, turning to face him. We need to set boundaries. This can't happen again, Dylan. It can't." He nodded, though his expression betrayed the hurt he was trying to hide. "I understand," he said. "I'll stay out of your way." The days that followed were tense but uneventful. Dylan kept his word, avoiding me whenever possible. Meals were eaten in silence, and the easy camaraderie we once shared was replaced with an awkward distance that left the house feeling colder than ever. I threw myself into chores and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of that night in the kitchen. The kiss, the vulnerability in his eyes, the feelings I wasn't ready to confront. It wasn't until the weekend that everything came to a head. Greg called to let me know he'd be home the next day, and the news sent a wave of relief and anxiety through me. That evening, I found myself in the living room again, staring at the TV without really watching it. The sound of footsteps behind me made me tense, and I turned to see Dylan standing in the doorway. "I know I said I'd stay out of your way," he said, his voice hesitant, "but I need to talk to you, just one last time." I sighed, setting the remote aside. "What is it, Dylan?" He stepped into the room, his expression serious. "I just wanted to say goodbye." "Goodbye?" I repeated, frowning. "I've decided to go back to campus early," he said. "I think it's for the best." His words hit me harder than I expected. "You don't have to do that," I said quickly. "Greg will be home tomorrow. Things will go back to normal." "There is no normal after this, Rachel," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Not for me. I need space. Time to figure things out." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "I just need you to know. I don't regret how I feel about you. I regret putting you in this position, but I don't regret the way you've made me feel. You've been the one bright spot in my life, and I'll always be grateful for that." Tears welled in my eyes as I struggled to find the right words. "Dylan," but he shook his head, cutting me off. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused. "Goodbye, Rachel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. The next day came too quickly, and the house was unusually quiet without Dylan. I hadn't realized just how much his presence filled the space. His footsteps, his laughter, the way he seemed to breathe life into the otherwise empty house. Now, without him, it felt hollow. I moved through the day on autopilot, forcing myself to tidy up the house in preparation for Greg's return. As I wiped down the counters and vacuumed the floors, I tried to push Dylan from my mind, but the memory of his goodbye lingered, replaying in my thoughts like a song I couldn't turn off. Greg arrived home in the early evening, tired but cheerful. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, his suitcase thudding against the floor as he set it down in the entryway. "How's everything been here?" he asked as I handed him a glass of water. "Fine," I said with a forced smile. "Quiet. And Dylan, where is he?" "He decided to go back to campus early," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Said he wanted to get a head start on his classes." Greg nodded, accepting my explanation without question. "That kid's always been independent," he said with a chuckle. I smiled faintly, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. The evening passed uneventfully, though I felt like I was walking on eggshells. Every time Greg spoke, I found myself hyper-aware of my tone, my expressions, as though I were guarding a secret that might spill out at any moment. By the time we went to bed, I was emotionally exhausted. Lying next to Greg, listening to his even breaths as he drifted off to sleep, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. How had things gotten so complicated? What had I done to allow everything to spiral out of control? The following week, life resumed its normal rhythm, at least on the surface. Greg went back to work, and I filled my days with errands, chores, and the occasional lunch with friends. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, I was struggling. Dylan's absence was palpable, and though I tried to focus on the positives, that he was giving us both the space we needed, I couldn't shake the ache that settled in my chest whenever I thought of him. I kept expecting to hear from him, a text, a phone call, anything to let me know he was okay. But the days stretched into weeks, and there was nothing. One afternoon, as I was organizing some old photo albums in the attic, I came across a picture of Dylan from when he first joined the family. He was 14, awkward and shy, his smile hesitant as he stood next to Greg. I remembered that day vividly, how nervous I had been about meeting him, how much I had wanted to make a good impression. I traced the edges of the photo with my fingers, a lump forming in my throat. How had we gone from that to this? Tears blurred my vision, and I set the photo aside, burying my face in my hands. I had made so mistakes, so many lines I never thought I would, and now I was left to pick up the pieces, trying to make sense of the mess I had created. A week later, as I was cleaning the kitchen, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Dylan's name. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I should answer. but curiosity and longing won out, and I swiped to accept the call. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling slightly. "House." "I know," he said softly. There was a pause, then, "I hope it's okay that I called." "It's fine," I said quickly, leaning against the counter for support. "How are you?" "I'm okay," he said. "School's been busy." There was a pause, and I could tell he was trying to find the right words. "I just wanted to check in," he said finally, "to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed the truth. "Are you?" he asked gently. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the counter. "No," I admitted. "I'm not." And there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he might have hung up. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," I said, my throat tightening. "But it doesn't make it any easier." We talked for a while, our words tentative and heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. He told me about his classes, his friends, how he was trying to move forward. I told him about the house, about Greg, about how I was trying to do the same. By the time we hung up, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't closure, not entirely, but it was something, a step toward healing, perhaps. The weeks turned into months, and slowly the ache began to fade. Dylan stayed away, focusing on his studies, and I threw myself into rebuilding my marriage. Greg and I started spending more time together, rediscovering the connection that had been lost in the chaos of his work and my loneliness. But even as life began to stabilize, I knew that a part of me would always carry the memory of what had happened, the mistakes I had made, the lines I had crossed. They were scars I would carry with me forever. One evening, as Greg and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he reached over and took my hand. "I know I haven't been the best husband," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But I'm going to try harder. I promise." I squeezed his hand, a lump forming in my throat. "Me too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and pink, I felt a fragile sense of hope. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. The weeks turned into months, and with every passing day, the weight of what had transpired between Dylan and me grew heavier in my heart. Though life had seemingly returned to normal, the cracks beneath the surface were undeniable. I carried the secret like a stone in my chest, one I could never share, not with Greg, not with anyone. Greg had made good on his promise to be more present. He began cutting back on his business trips, spending more time at home, and making an effort to rekindle the spark in our marriage. At first, I welcomed his attempts, hoping, but no matter how hard I tried to focus on Greg, Dylan lingered in my thoughts like a ghost. The smallest things, a song on the radio, a phrase Greg would say, brought him back to me, and I'd find myself retreating into the solitude of my mind, unable to shake the ache of his absence. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email from Dylan. It was brief and to the point, but the sight of his name in my inbox sent a rush of emotions coursing through me. "Hi, Rachel. I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I'm sorry for putting you in such a difficult position, but I'll always be grateful for the time we spent together, even if things got complicated. You've meant more to me than I can put into words, and I hope you know that. Take care of yourself." Done. I read the email over and over, my chest tightening with each pass. It was clear he was trying to move on, to create distance, and a part of me was grateful for his maturity. But another part, the part I wasn't proud of, longed to respond, to reach out and tell him that he wasn't alone in his feelings. Instead, I closed my laptop and walked away, tears streaming down my face. That evening, as Greg and I sat down for dinner, he noticed my distracted demeanor. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a long day." "You've been saying that a lot lately," he said, his tone gentle but probing. "Is there something you're not telling me?" My heart raced, panic bubbling beneath the surface. "No, of course not," I said, my voice trembling ever so slightly. "I'm fine, really." Greg didn't press further, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. As the months wore on, the distance between Greg and me began to shrink. We started going on dates again, spending weekends together, and finding ways to reconnect. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like we were rebuilding something that had been lost long before Dylan had entered the picture. But even as our relationship improved, I couldn't ignore the part of me that felt like a fraud. Every smile, every kiss, every moment of laughter with Greg was tainted by the knowledge of what I had done, of the boundaries I had crossed, and the feelings I still couldn't fully let go of. One evening, Greg suggested we take a weekend trip to the lake house where we'd spent our honeymoon. I agreed, hoping the change of scenery might help clear my mind. The trip was peaceful and nostalgic, filled with long walks along the shore and quiet evenings by the fire. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm, a fleeting glimpse of the life I had once envisioned for us. But as we sat on the dock watching the sun set over the water, Greg turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "Rachel," he said, his voice steady, "there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." My stomach dropped, and I braced myself for what was coming. "You've been different lately," he continued. "Distant. And I can't help but feel like there's something you're not telling me." "Greg, I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I'm not accusing you of anything," he said quickly. I need to know if there's something going on, if there's something I've done or haven't done that's made you feel this way." Tears welled in my eyes, and I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not you," I said quietly. "It's me." "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. I hesitated, my mind racing. The truth was too dangerous, too devastating to share. But I couldn't keep lying to him, not completely. "I've been struggling," I said finally, "with loneliness, with feeling like I'm not enough." Greg reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Rachel, you are enough," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You always have been, and if I've made you feel otherwise, then I'm the one who needs to do better." His words cut deep, filling me with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. I nodded, unable to speak, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the weeks that followed, Greg and I continued to rebuild our relationship, piece by fragile piece. I threw myself into making things work, determined to atone for my mistakes and find a way forward. Dylan stayed away, and though I missed him deeply, I knew it was for the best. His absence was a painful reminder of the choices I had made and the consequences that came with them. Months later, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, my phone buzzed with a new message. I glanced at the screen and saw Dylan's name. "Just wanted to let you know I'm doing okay. Hope you are too." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart aching with a mix of longing and relief. After a moment, I typed a short reply. "I'm glad to hear that. Take care of yourself, Dylan." And with that, I set my phone aside, turning my attention back to the stove. It wasn't closure, not entirely, but it was a step forward, a small, fragile step toward healing.